Let me share a little bit with regards to Genesis chapter 1 as a background. Um, why I feel that Genesis is so important is because it is the beginning of how we would read the Bible. And it is in Hebrew. Nevertheless, it's not in English, although we all read English. So this is an attempt to help us who are not familiar with the Hebrew to have a little bit more context and a little bit more depth behind the English to figure some of these things out. Now, some of the things that I'm trying to explain to you may be new. It may be, well, you might think that it's quite novel. I'm trying to suggest that this is quite the opposite. I'm trying to highlight to you what the Hebrew text actually tries to tell us. And it is not easy to explain all the Hebrew into the English because we don't have exact meaning one-to-one correspondence. This evening, I would like to just talk about Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5, because it's enough for us to have a good feel of how Genesis is all about. So the first thing I want to point out to you very quickly is this. When we read our English Bible, we call this book the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis comes from the Greek word, Genesis. And so our English Bible actually have Greek names. In the Hebrew scrolls, it is called Bereshit. And Bereshit basically is the first word of the book of Genesis. That's how we would understand it, all right? So moving forward, let me just give you a highlight. I'm saying that this 5 verses is so crucial because it shapes your understanding to the rest of the Bible. It may affect your understanding of your current understanding, but that's fine. We're here to learn, and I'm here to share with you a different perspective of the book of Genesis. Now, let me first declare to you my position. I believe in God. I believe that the Bible is God's word, and I believe in the young earth tradition, that this world is not that old, okay? But nevertheless, this whole thing about the book of Genesis is really not about science. It's to tell us from a Hebrew viewpoint how God looks at things. Genesis 1 verse 1 is also known as Bereshit 1:1, right? Bereshit 1:1. This is the first verse of the Bible. It reads from right to left, from here, this side, and this is how Hebrew is read, from right to left. English is read from left to right. And so it begins by saying this. And so let me just highlight. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et haaretz. And that's all the Hebrew you ever want to learn if you don't care about Hebrew. It's quite amazing if you can quote the first verse in Hebrew. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et haaretz. So basically, we have this English translation below here. And let me then go into some level of detail that we can appreciate. And that's what I want to highlight to you are the details. Let me first explain this slide, and the future slides will look something like this. We are studying the 5 verses of Genesis very much from a Hebrew perspective, which means that we will be using Hebrew text. But you can actually ignore much of all these things because we're not here to learn Hebrew. We're here to appreciate Hebrew, that's all. And so it begins by saying Bereshit, and it has a preposition, and it has a noun. And this noun, Reshit, actually means first in place, time in order, or rank. It means best. It means chief, summit, the choice parts, right? All these things are important for us to realize that the beginning of this verse talks about in beginning. That's how we have been translating it. But it doesn't have to be in beginning, because in beginning requires us to fill in an article. And here the article would be a or the, because it does not exist in the Hebrew. And so in the traditional English translation, we have been choosing the definite article the in the beginning instead of in a beginning. Why? Well, it is a translator's choice of word because there is only a preposition and a noun. There is no article, which we find articles here and here. Typically, in every language, when there is no article, I personally do not encourage the insertion of an article because it will be telling you something definite when it is not there. As such, I have a preference of not using articles. And here, I have translated it as at first. And it means as good. At first, this is how the story begins. That's what it is. Long, long ago, far, far away, in the distant past, at first, this happened. And that is how I would see the story goes. In beginning or in the beginning does not actually quite fit the entire phrase here. Although the English translators have always translated this as in the beginning by inserting the definite article. Now, I am not in favor of that. Now, is there a difference? And I think there is a slight difference. When it says in the beginning, the focus would be on beginning. What beginning? And then thereabouts, you have to explain additional information which does not exist in the text. In what beginning? The beginning. The specific beginning. What is that specific beginning? And that is why we will get into trouble when we insert words into the text. But if you say at first, that's not a problem. It's the beginning of the story, the narrative of this event in chapter 1. That's all it's trying to say. Now, moving on, I'm saying here that the key to Genesis 1:1 is this word here. And it is pronounced as bara. Bara is a verb, and it's an action word. Now, in the Hebrew, action words are king. I will tell you this. Verbs in Hebrew is king. Why? Because much of the messages and the communication in Hebrew revolves around activities, execution, doing, looking at movement. Now, why is that so? It's a very simple explanation. Remember, Hebrew is a listening language. It is meant for people to sit down and to listen to what is said so that it can play back in your head everything that's moving, basically to activate a video in your head. And so action words are important. The Hebrew does not use abstract meaning. It uses concrete words to express abstract things so that your mind can put a picture to what you hear. Now, this is very crucial when we need to read the Bible. As you know, in the good old days, people in the synagogues or in the temple do not say, let's all turn to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. They don't have that luxury. So they have to go to the temple, and the priest will then open the scroll and read, and everybody is supposed to listen. So at the time when Moses was explaining this to the Israelites before they crossed the Jordan, this is to play in their head what Moses is trying to say about God. And all these words called verbs or action words is to conjure the imagery in their head. They are supposed to sit down and look into their minds who this God is as the story is being narrated. So it's at first Elohim. And it's usually translated as God, but the word El, which is singular, basically means the mighty one. And who are the mighty ones in the Bible? Well, it applies to rulers, judges, angels, God, or gods, or idols, mighty men, right? And that's how the word El come about. Now, we have used this Elohim to think that, oh, this is God's name, but it's not. It is a term, a definition of a noun, the mighty one. And in this particular case, it is of this mighty one that is doing this bara action. So we have not talked about bara action, but I will come back to that. So this is translated as God. And he did a bara here, right? And I'm saying that this bara that God is doing is to conjure the imagery in the minds of the young Israelites to know who God is. When they enter into the promised land, they are supposed to remember this God. And he is now here called Elohim, the mighty one. He is the one that did all this. What did he do, basically? He bara. That is the key to Genesis 1:1. He shaped, he filled, he formed. And the first question you would ask me is, where is the word create? It does not exist. We have it in our English Bible, and I'll explain to you why we have it in an English Bible. But we have always been told that God is the one who created everything from nothing, and that's why we are trying to explain the word create. But here, the Hebrew word for bara is to shape, to cut into shape, to fill it up, or to form, or even to make. That is a good enough word. And so we need to understand the action of bara is done on what? Here. Hashamayim, the skies, and haaretz, the land. And I prefer to use land instead of earth because they are about to enter into the promised land. Chapter 1 of Genesis is not a science lecture, and Moses is not interested to talk about the earth as a globe. And so the Chinese Bible translates it quite properly, and it is translated as Ti, which is land. So in the beginning is not correct. It should be at first Elohim, or you would like the word God, filled the skies and the land. And that's how the story begins. Which means this, that the sky is empty and the land is unformed. This is the picture of Genesis 1:1. The key is this word, bara. And we shall take a quick look at the word bara. Now, why do I say it is shape, fill, form, and not create? It is because the Bible has never ever used the word bara to mean make something out of nothing. It is always to make something out of something that already exists. So it is about shaping, it's about filling when it's empty, like the sky is empty, how is it filled? That the land is empty, how is it filled? And it assumes that the sky and land is already there. So let's take a quick look at this. So let me give you a summary. Since this is the key word, then at first Elohim filled the skies and the land, would focus on the key process of filling. The first thing that Elohim did was to fill the skies and the land. That's how the phrase Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et haaretz would mean. However, in the traditional reading of the English text, we have a different connotation. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is trying to say that the key process is about making something out of nothing, and make what? Heavens and earth. At the same time, it presumes that the skies and the land did not exist before this time, and even then, some will go far enough to say that God created time as the beginning. It is the beginning of time and is the beginning of creation. Now that would be the traditional understanding when it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. I'm here to suggest to you that that would not be a fair reading. The fair reading would be this. At first, as the story goes, the first thing that God ever did was to fill up the skies and the land as the young Israelites look at the land and the sky above them. This is the story of filling the unfilled skies and the unfilled land. Does this give us a good picture? Well, I think one of the most important things is to understand what does the Bible say about bara. I think that would be a very important point. So don't take my word for it. You should do your own research to look at it. Now, where do we get the word create to mean create something from nothing? Creatio ex nihilo is actually a Latin word. It's a Latin word for create from nothing. It is a view that at the very beginning in Genesis 1:1, the universe and the whole of space-time continuum is created by a free act of God out of nothing, and not either out of some pre-existing material or out of the divine substance itself. It's just out of nothing. And that's the explanation for this word, create. And the Catholics have this as a catechism. We believe that God needs no pre-existing thing or help in order to create. Now understand with me, in the confessions of faith, it pleased God to create something out of nothing. Now, I think before we go further, I want to clarify. At no point in time am I saying that in the very beginning, before Genesis 1:1, if I assume that the land and the skies were already there, like it must be God who, well, for the lack of a better word, created the heavens and the earth from nothing. And I won't argue with that. But I'm suggesting that that point in time is not Genesis 1:1. It is after, and it is describing an empty sky and an empty land, which is a shell. Now, where do we get the word create? In the Latin. The Latin Vulgate, which was translated at 383 BC, AD, had the word creavit. So where do you find it? Here. crevit, and that is the Latin word. And from there, we have adopted lots of Latin words. What are some of the Latin words that we have adopted in the English? Creatio, salvatio, justificatio, testamentum, sanctificatio, regeneratio, raptura, publicanus, apostolus, ecclesia, evangelium, pascha, angelus. These are all Latin words which found its way into our English translation. So did we translate from the Hebrew to the English? The answer is not quite. Now, you do remember that the Old Testament was translated into Greek around 275 BC. Interestingly, the Greek says this: in the beginning, God made the heaven and the earth. That is apoesen. God made. There was no idea of create something out of nothing at 275 BC when they translated the original word bara to the Greek. I just want you to see this is because there is some history that the word create, to mean create out of nothing, is not there in its original context. But we have Bible scholars like Augustine, John Calvin, John Wesley, Matthew Henry, and practically everybody, most of everybody talks about that. The arguments for creatio ex nihilo comes from Hebrews chapter 11 verse 3. Through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed, and it's translated frame, but it comes from the word katartizo, by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made, come to being assembled, right, of things which do appear. And this is final, something that shines, that can be seen. Revelation 4:1:1, for you have created, and that's where the word katitzo comes in. It actually means to fabricate, to found, to form. It does not mean to make something out of nothing. Not even the Greek supports this idea. And then when you read Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 27, and Elohim said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. And so God created man in his own image, in the image of God, created he, him, male and female. So that's the first part when we are told, oh, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him male and female. And so if you know the creation story in Genesis chapter 2, how man was formed from the dust of the ground, and the woman was formed from the rib of a man, clearly the words here in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27 of create does not mean to create something out of nothing. It is to form and fill man from something that God has already made. Now, if you try to study the word bara, and you should, as good Bible students, go and search the concordances, the interlinear, look for the word bari, bara, and all the variants. Because this verb can be modified to be bari in Genesis 41 verse 2. And in Genesis 41 verse 2, bari means to fatten, to make fat. The 7 fat cows and the 7 lean cows. So the fat means plump. Bari, to be fattened, to be filled, right? Joshua chapter 17, verse 15. And Joshua answered them, if you are a great people, then get up to the wood country and bara. It's a cut down, to chip it down into a form for yourself there in the land of the Perizzites. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 29, he says, on my offering which I have commanded in my habitation, and honor your sons above me, to make yourselves fat with the chief of all the offerings of Israel, my people. That's bara, fat. It doesn't mean to create something out of nothing. Psalm chapter 51, verse 10. David was praying to God and asking God to create, right? To create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit within me. Is God making a new heart for David from totally out of nothing? Actually, David is asking God to cleanse him, make him a new heart, renew him with a right character. It is not to give him a brand new heart from nowhere, right? Isaiah chapter 4, verse 5. And the Lord will create upon every dwelling place of Mount Zion and upon her assemblies a cloud of smoke by day and the shining of flame of fire by night. This create is to fill. Ezekiel chapter 23, verse 47. And the company shall stone them with stones and dispatch them with their swords. What does that mean? It means to cut them down with their swords. Cut down. That's bara. Right? Cut down. So you see, all these meanings never ever meant something out of nothing. So what are the implications? What are the implications if bara does not mean create something out of nothing? If bara means to make something out of nothing, then the reader will have an implied meaning of time and existence, with a challenge of the existent presence of the angels. When did the angels come from? We have to argue on the age of the universe, maybe inferred from something like the Big Bang Theory, which I don't believe in. So the word bara here does not mean to create something out of nothing. The word bara merely means to fill. So if the word bara means to fill, then the reader will have thoughts of a continuation of an ongoing series of events, which is what Genesis chapter 1 is all about, a series of events. And this is at the first of this filling process, the bara process, right? This is the bara process of the space and land, so that the understanding of the angels, space, land, it's already there. So Moses never bothered to discuss that. So the question is, then how long before? Well, in the Hebrew, when it's not said, nobody will ask that question. But we ask that question. In the interest of Hebrew, it could be a day, it could be a second, a millisecond, or a long time before, and how long we don't know. But we do know that it is some time before, and based on a young earth perspective, it's not that long. Not that long, right? Not billions of years, basically. And so we can see this. From the rest of the passage, we read, let the earth bring forth vegetation, verse 11. Let the earth bring forth living creatures, verse 24. And God formed Ha'adam of the dust from the Ha'adamah, chapter 2, verse 7. And out of the ground the Lord made to spring up things. So what do we see is God used whatever that was already there. It was already in place. So God said, let the land bring forth. Let the land bring forth. And God formed Ha-Adamah out of the dust from the ground or the soil, which is already on the land. So all we can see is the land has always been there, but how is God going to fill the land with things? And that's how we would read the word bara. So throughout chapter 1, the Bible describes how the space, which is the skies, okay, you need to understand that would be the skies, and the land was, in particular, filled according to what Elohim desired. So understand this, the filling of the land and the sky is according to what God wants. And he said it, and so it was. And so this is a very dynamic and vivid imagery as Moses described this so that the young Israelites can play that movie in their head. The chief purpose is to direct the attention of the hearer to this very important thing, the majesty and the power of God. The entire Genesis and the entire Bible, for all intents and purposes, is to help the reader or the listener in this case take a good grasp of who God is. It is not a science lecture, again, I tell you this. It is for them to look at the sky and the sea and the land. This is God. This is Elohim. As you go in to inherit the land with the sky above you, always remember Elohim. This is for the hearer to be in awe of Elohim. And more importantly, to know him and to keep his words. And so we come to verse 2, and verse 2 is tricky. Verse 2 is tricky. So we begin with the first portion of verse 2. The first portion of verse 2 reads this way. V'haaretz haita tohu v'vohu. So let me repeat that. V'haaretz haita tohu v'vohu. Doesn't sound anything to us. I wanted to read this to you because just imagine if you understood Hebrew like the children of Israel and they listened to this, it would conjure an imagery in their mind. But since we don't, so we have to read the text so that we understand this a little better. And so here the word and. Haaretz is the land. And now we have a very difficult phrase to translate. And the word is haita. Haita comes from the word haya, meaning this is how it exists. It comes to life. It comes to being. It happens this way. It comes into existence. It's living like this. Now, how do you translate that in English? Very difficult, I would say. And so we use words like exists, right? So the land, it existed. It is in existence that way, right? It doesn't need to be that it comes into that position because when it first happened, when God made the sky and the land, God is now explaining this is what happened to the skies and the land. It is tohu vavohu. What in the world is tohu vavohu? This is fundamentally what it means. Without form or without shape, and it's empty, nothing inside. And I'm suggesting to you, it means that there is no life, nothing. And so this is how the skies and the land started as. And so here, God is explaining this is about the land. And the land was without form and without life. Now, what does that mean? It means that it has no shape and there was no life inside. There was nothing. God hasn't made anything yet. And carrying on, and it says, V'choshek al penei tahom, right? V'choshek penei tahom basically means darkness. Darkness was on the face of the deep waters. So the beginning of the land is filled with deep waters. And that's what it says up to this point. And it was darkness. So now the question we need to ask is, darkness is already in existence as well. You see? And what else is already in existence on the land? Water. Lots of water and darkness. Now understand, darkness is a thing. And it is only sitting on top of the water. It's on the face of the water. So this is how you need to understand darkness. Darkness is not all over the place. Darkness is just sitting on top of the water. So you need to understand darkness as a thing. And then moving on next, and Ruach Elohim is usually translated the Spirit of God. I would suggest that we look at the word, the breath, or the air, or the wind of God. I think wind is a good expression. The wind of God, all right, is hovering. This is merekafet. Merekafet is to flutter, to hover, to move back and forth, right? Is to, well, some people say it's like brooding, like a mother hen brooding a chicken, trying to hatch the egg. Well, that's what the wind of God is doing, is blowing back and forth where? On the face, on the surface of the water. Water. And so what do we have? We have a parallel. The parallel is very distinct in Hebrew, but it's not distinct in the English. We have one piece here, and then we have another piece here. And these are two parallel passages, and I'll show you what it means. Genesis 1 verse 2. And the land existed unformed and unfilled. And this is how we understood the previous part of verse 2. But this part here is what I want to point out to you, which is the second part, which is this. This is one section, one segment. This is another segment. And these are parallels. Parallels means in a Hebrew sentence structure, it is trying to say the same thing two slightly different ways, but it's the same idea. Okay? So the first one is there's darkness. There's on the surface of the deep, lots of water. And waters here again. Upon the face, it's all on the face only. And it's hovering. The wind of Elohim and the darkness are talking about the same thing. The wind of Elohim and darkness are both on top of the face of the water. This is the important thing in the Hebrew that is trying to bring out. This is a parallel thought. So what does the parallelism mean? The parallelism is to show us this, that v'choshek, which is the darkness, and v'ruach Elohim, they are connected. They are the parallel of each other. On the surface, they are parallel to each other. Oops. Sorry. Wrong here. The darkness and the wind of Elohim hovering. Right? This whole thing is one piece. Right? What is darkness and what is the wind hovering? That's one piece. The second piece here is alpene upon the surface, which is the same. It is not inside the water. It is above the water, right on top of the water, which is called the surface. And the last part is the deep. Lots of water and in the waters, and they are apparel. That's what I'm trying to show, that Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 is trying to express what is exactly happening to the land at this point in time. There is darkness and there is a wind that's blowing, and it's called the wind of Elohim. So I just want to point out to you now, this used to be one that has animation. I can't show the animation here. And I just want to point out to you, this is all very dark and black and darkness. And right at the bottom here, you find that this is water. On top there, blowing back and forth, would be the wind of Elohim, and it's also darkness. Now, I want to explain to you why the two are connected. What is darkness? And I suggested to you that if darkness and wind is connected, then it must be a thing. Darkness is not a state of no light. Darkness can move. And so these are the phrases you have. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And darkness, where is its place? It can move. It has a locality. And this is where we read in Job chapter 38. God inhabits darkness. So the wind of Elohim expresses the presence of God. I form the light and I create darkness, and I fill the darkness basically, right? This word create means to fill. I make the peace and fill calamity and shape calamities. I, the Lord, do all these things. So God inhabits darkness. Now, darkness can be caused by clouds. Now, this is clear here. 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 12. He made darkness, canopies around him, dark waters, and thick clouds of the sky. So the presence of God is shown by darkness, right? Locusts covered the face of the whole earth, and the land was darkened. So something is covering, it's a canopy, right? So that is what darkness is. Darkness can move as the locusts move. Lamp. The light is dark in his tent, and his lamp beside him is put out. So darkness and lamp is apparel to each other, right? When the lamp is put out, it is dark. So perhaps you would need to understand that darkness is not, it's not the absence of light. It is always associated with thick black clouds. Now, you can read this from the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament by Johannes Bordeweck. And you would see that in the ancient past, ancient Middle East, darkness is always linked with thick black clouds. And so it can be felt, and it can move back and forth. Psalm 18 verse 11, he made darkness his secret place. His canopy around him was dark waters and thick clouds of the sky. So notice, when the clouds are thick, it is darkness. You can't see the light. 2 Samuel 22 12, he made darkness canopies around him, dark waters and thick clouds of the skies. So darkness can be felt. In Exodus chapter 10, when it talks about the darkness upon Egypt, that there may be darkness. And this is darkness which can be felt over the land of Egypt. And then we see that Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and then there was a thick darkness. Why does darkness have a thickness? Because it is with reference to thick clouds. The reason being is, here darkness is choshek in Hebrew. Thick darkness is choshek arafel, which is thick clouds. And they are both expressed the same way. So Job speaks of darkness. He covers deep things out of darkness and brings shadow of death to light. He has set my darkness in my path. He has drew a circular horizon, all right, on the face of the waters and at the boundary of light and darkness. And so that would be the horizon. God speaks of the darkness of clouds, right? This is important. When God speaks to the people, Moses drew near the thick clouds, Arafel, where he meets God. Deuteronomy chapter 5:22. These words of the Lord spoke to all your assembly in the mountain from the midst of fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness. God is always associated with darkness here. So darkness, do not always assume it to be bad. It is a description that there is a canopy around God and is shielding man from God, and it looks dark. So I won't read all this. So now we go to verse 3. Verse 3 is interesting because verse 3 is the beginning of a speech, something that was said. It says, Vayomer Elohim Yahi Or Vayahi Or. Now, means nothing to you when you don't know Hebrew. Basically, it says this. Va is and. Yahi, he spoke, he said something. He declared, he commanded something. Who's commanded? Elohim made the commandment. And he says, Yahi comes from the word Haya again. It came to existence. Or, that is light, something that's bright. And you remember, brightness have a place as well, and dark, so does darkness. And it happened that light came. So basically, I would just want to point out two things here. One, you could probably imagine that if this was something that was spoken and you were hearing it, the imagery that is to conjure in your mind is that as God made his commands and declared out, the brightness or is or, and it comes from the English word order, or came to pass, came about, and God, well, you could actually imagine that light just came into the presence of God. So think of it that way. And when God said, let the light come, and then the light came. That's how it's expressed in the Hebrew. That's the first thing I want to point out to you. But the second thing I want to point out to you is this word. It means nothing to you, but these words are a very special class of verbs which are called consecutive verbs. Verbs that comes in a series, one after another. And so this action that Elohim did when he spoke or he commanded and he declared came after verse 2 happened. And all down the order of Genesis chapter 1, you will get this particular verb style. And this is what we call consecutive. One after another. Now, why is this important? Is because as you hear what is spoken, you cannot have 10 things happening in your movie, in your head. You can only have one thing at a time. And as God describes this verse 3, you are to imagine now God is speaking. He makes this command and light came into the presence and suddenly light appeared. So basically that's what verse 3 is describing. This is the power of the Hebrew expressions. And it is important because it goes line by line. So something happens, then the next thing happened. And so you find that I have translated it as and then. And then helps us understand that this happened after the previous verse and not before. Okay? These are my notes. I just want to highlight to you that it is important to note that God uses these sequential or consecutive verbs, that each event follows the previous event. So after describing verse 2, and then God spoke. God didn't speak earlier on. God only spoke after verse 2 was described. When it says brightness come, it gives the imagery in your mind that the light just moved into place. Before God spoke, it didn't. And so what do you get? Another sequential verb. God said brightness to come, and then brightness came. So all of these are sequential verbs. First, verse 2 happened, then God spoke, then the light appeared. You see all this? And the light is capable of action. It is trying to tell the light, you must appear, and the light appeared, and the light came. And so these are the imagery that is in the mind of the Israelites when they hear these words. Now we come to verse 4. Now verse 4 is interesting. Vayomer Elohim et haor kitov. What it's trying to say in simple English is this: another one of those sequential verbs. Vayomer Elohim, and then Elohim. Okay, what did he do? What did he do? He was looking. Sorry. This is not Vayomer, this is Vayara, right? Vayara. Vayara means to inspect, to see, to look at, to perceive, to consider. It's from the root word ra'ah. V'ra'ah, v'yara, right? V'yara is spoken this way. V'yara, and it is a sequential verb that happened after the light appeared. And now God looked at the light. Why does God need to look at the light? What does it mean by God looking at the light? I prefer to translate it this way. That God inspected. He told the light to do something. The light did something. And God looked at the light or inspected the light and considered what it has done. And so what did God look? God looked at the illumination, the brightness that it appeared. And then it says, it's kitov. It looks like it is good. Looks like it is good. Now, it is important for us then to understand what does good actually mean. Now to us, good is thumbs up, right? And so in the Hebrew cannot express thumbs up, right? There is no such word called thumbs up in Hebrew. So the word tov here literally means doing what is intended. God instructed the illumination to appear before him, and then the illumination appeared before him, and then God looked and inspected this illumination and saw that it was doing what is intended, and that is good. That is what good is. If we are doing what God intends, then we are good. God looked at the light and said it was good because it was functioning the way God had intended it to. And now you get the imagery that God is like an engineer. He is putting things in place. He is slowly filling this empty skies and empty land with things. And now we reach to the second part of verse 4. And then this is important for us to understand because it says, Vayavdel Elohim ben Haor v'ben Hachoshek. Means nothing to you right now, but it's okay. Let me just explain very quickly. This word is another consecutive sequential verb, meaning after God had inspected just now, God is now doing another thing after the inspection. That God says, well, it's doing what is intended. Let me do another thing. And what is God doing? God is trying to make distinct, make separate. So if you have this box, you have light and then you have dark. God is trying to make clear that, well, this is dark and this is light. This is the distinction. Otherwise, they just blend with each other. And so God says, I want to separate them out and make a separation, a band of the light, a band of light, right? Or a separation of light with the band of darkness. So that now you can tell the darkness from the brightness and it can be separated out. And this is what God is doing in Vayavdel. It's a sequential. After God said it's good, God is now making clear the distinction. And this God doing work. God is doing work here. And so this is what Job 26:10 means. God drew a circular horizon, a hook, that is a circle, above the face of the waters, at the boundary of light and darkness. So God made very clear there is light on one end and there's darkness, and there is a way to see the distinction of light and dark. And that is what verse 4 actually means. Now we go to verse 5, finishing off. The first part of verse 5 says this: Vayikra Elohim la'or yom v'lachoshek kara laila. Two things that's happening here. Vayikra, okay? Vayikra is a very important phrase that you need to know. It's a sequential action. And it happened after God separated the darkness and the brightness. God gave name. God gave name. So Vayikra is God giving a name to the brightness, Laor, and called it Yom. the lachoshek, to the darkness, called it Laila. Now this is what it means. And then, remember it's consecutive. Elohim gave name to the brightness. He calls it day. And to the darkness, he gave name night. Now this is important in the Hebrew context. This is the first time that God is actually giving names. He gave names to the bright part. He calls it day. So the bright part has a name. It's called day. Now, every time you read day, you need to understand the context. Is God speaking about the name, the brightness called day? Or is God referring to the entire 24-hour day? And the darkness, is God referring to the darkness itself? Or is God referring to the darkness he gave a name called night? And in the Hebrew culture, whenever somebody gives name to another, the giver of the name is the master of the thing. So Elohim is the master of the brightness called day, and Elohim is the master of the darkness called night. And this is how verse 5 is understood. In the last part of 5b, 5b gives us another expression. Vayahi Aref, Vayahi Aref, and this is where it comes from. Vayahi Aref, Vahi Boker, Yom Echad. Now, what it exactly means is this. Vayahi, remember I told you it was a bit difficult to explain Vayahi, but it basically talks about coming into existence, becoming, happening, and that is the whole picture. So in your mind, this thing is happening. What is happening? Aref. And then what is happening after the Aref? Voker. Wow. Two things, one after another. And in the English, we always say, and it was evening and it was morning, right? These were the words that we use. I want to explain to you that this is not exactly what is said here. What is actually said here is this. It is growing dark and it is growing bright. Aref means it's dark and it gets darker and it's darker. Voker, which we translate morning, it is the beginning of light and it gets brighter and brighter and brighter. And so I have tried to say, and it came to pass, there is growing darkness and then growing brightness. And that is the imagery that's in the mind of the listener. Evening means nothing. Morning means nothing. But if in your mind, after God separated the darkness and separated the brightness and then gave them names, and then it says, and then it grew darker and then it grew brighter. Now notice, everything that was done in verses 1 to 4, as described, happened very quickly. Then it grew darker. So it was actually the early part of the evening that God quickly finished the work. And then it grew dark and then it grew bright. The Jews look at this and says, this is how our day is. It starts when it grows dark and it ends when it is growing dark. And so it begins after sunset and it ends by sunset. This is the Jewish or the Hebrew concept of the day. And here you find Yom Echad, the first day. Echad is very important, and it is always understood as the first, and Yom is day. Now, is this a 24-hour day? And I would submit to you, yes, because it is describing it's growing dark, and then it grows bright, and that's the whole day. And that's a 24-hour day. And it's described as the first day when God did something. Why is this important is, as we go along, you would learn in the book of Genesis chapter 1, God is teaching the Israelites to understand who is God. The master of the day is God. God gave names. God separated the darkness from the brightness. And God called this first time of going dark and growing light as Echad, the first day. So learn to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. That's all the numbers the Israelites are supposed to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, Echad also has another interesting thing with our New Testament. When you read in the book of Acts, the early Christians gathered on when? The first day of the week. What do you think is the first day of the week in Hebrew? Yom Echad. That's our Monday. Sorry, that's the Sunday, our Sunday, right? Yom Echad is our Sunday. Why? What is the seventh day in chapter 2? That is the day when God rested. That is the Shabbat. That's the Sabbath. That is Yom Shabbat. After Yom Shabbat is Yom Echad. So understand this, the Jewish Christians never gathered on Yom Shabbat. Why? Because on Yom Shabbat, it is to rest. But the moment Yom Shabbat is over, they come out to celebrate. And that's Yom Echad. The first day of the week is when the Christians gathered. And that's the significance of Echad, right? God is one. Elohe Echad. So this is an important number to remember. The first day is an ordinal, right? The first day, not one day. It's the first day. And so the first day of the week is the Sunday, where Christians gathered after the Shabbat, after the Sabbath. And hence God is trying to teach the Israelites a lot of things, like us too. That God is the master of the night and day. God is the master of the light, the darkness, and the brightness. God caused them to separate. God gave us an understanding of how the day works. It's a sunset, it grows dark, and then it grows bright. And then it grows dark, and then it grows bright. That's how the day works. So God is actually teaching the Israelites how to live. And if God is doing the teaching, God is the master and says, this is first day, Yom Echad. And he's trying to teach them to count. Why is counting so important? Because we will get to the fourth day when God put the sun, moon, and stars in place. It is for an appointment with God. And so Echad will tell them, count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the 7th day, on the 10th day, the 14th day. And this is what it means. And hence we have completed our first 5 verses of Genesis. Is there any questions? You can feel some questions and then we'll call it a day. Any questions? Okay.